one of the things I tried to say is that the empiricists basically bought into the observation that Descartes made, that basically our minds are first acquainted with our own inner perceptions. And you know, I like the way Richard Rorty described this. If you look at that cup, for John Locke, what we have is an inner picture, an inner representation of that cup. And you saw from those diagrams going all the way back to Descartes, people knew about the inverted image on the back of the retina even back then. But we're not talking about the inverted image on the back of the retina. We're talking about what your mind is immediately acquainted with. And for several reasons, one of which was that they didn't believe there was action at a distance, they were convinced, and Descartes pretty much convinced them, that what the mind is first acquainted with is its own inner perceptions, its own inner life. What Locke comes to call ideas. Now, I go into this a little bit, but for Locke, the word idea becomes a technical term. And basically, well, one way that a lot of people say this is that there's immediate objects of perception. In other words, what Locke's term for our inner soul or mind, in other words, the part of us that's aware of the world, is the understanding. And this is pretty much what Descartes calls the soul. And so for Locke, the understanding is that part of us which is aware. And so on a view like Locke's, what the mind is immediately acquainted with is not things in the external world directly, but with an internal picture or representation of things in the external world. And this causes real problems for him. And so the view that begins especially with Descartes and goes through all the British empiricists was sometimes called the theory of ideas, especially by Thomas Reid, its chief critic. And believe it or not, this view, when a lot of the problems with perception were revived among especially American and British philosophers in the early part of the 20th century, they revived the whole discussion about whether ideas are the immediate objects of perceptions, only they called it sense data, what are what we're immediately acquainted with. And they basically, people like Bertrand Russell, the early Wittgenstein, members of the Vienna School, A.J. Ayer, 20th century philosophers like that, even Willard Van Orman Quine, assumed that the immediate objects of perception are something internal to the mind. Now, what this does is it sets up I like the way they talk about it in the video, a gap between what you immediately perceive and the world out there. And this causes problems with perception that persisted and led to ever more skeptical positions throughout the British empiricists. Because once you put, Richard Rorty called this veil of ideas skepticism. Now Locke is not a skeptic, but the assumptions he starts out with ultimately lead to a kind of skepticism. So empiricism has serious problems, especially with perception as a result of this. And the one thing that I tried to point out last week is that the situation of the empiricists is this. They inherited from Descartes the problem Descartes was dealing with, being in the egocentric predicament, right? In other words, that the mind is in the middle, like we are if we're seated in a planetarium, and the mind is first acquainted with its own inner life, with its own perceptions and sensations, what Locke comes to call ideas. And the trick is to show whether any of these relate to anything beyond us, or are we in the matrix, or are we, like Descartes says, dreaming. Now, we saw that the way Descartes had of getting us out of this pickle was to rely on his innate ideas, especially his innate idea of God. In other words, he says, what marks did the cogito, ergo sum, the I think, therefore I am, have that marked it out as necessarily true? Well, it had the mark of clarity and distinctness. And we pointed out last time that this is a visual metaphor. This projector is in focus, so the image is clear, and the letters you see projected on the screen are distinct from one another. Whereas if we got this thing out of focus, the letters would no longer be clear, and they, as you know, what happens with an out-of-focus projector, they would bleed into one another. They would not be distinct from one another. So Descartes uses this visual metaphor, and so he looks into his mind to see if he has any other ideas that have this mark of necessary truth. And not surprisingly, he comes upon his idea of God. And it's exactly the same idea that we looked at when we looked at the ontological argument, especially Descartes' version, because Descartes uses the ontological argument, and Descartes' strategy was from his innate idea of God to show via some a priori arguments, the most famous being the ontological argument, that God exists and God has all these perfect qualities, and a God who exists like that is no deceiver. And so the way he gets back our confidence in mathematics and in the existence of a real external world is to say, well, I've proved the existence of a God who's no deceiver, and God would in some sense be a deceiver. I mentioned this last time, but I'm reviewing because not everyone was here. God would in some sense be a deceiver if he created me so that I thought there was a real table here, and there wasn't. So Descartes' way of getting back everything he questioned is this roundabout way of trying to prove God's existence from his innate idea of God, and then from the proof that God exists and is no deceiver, getting back our confidence in things like mathematics and observational statements, coming based on the senses, the things he questioned. So Descartes didn't want to end a skeptic. He wanted to get everything back. And that's how he tries to do it, from that one assumption, that one axiom, I think, therefore I am. Well, what I say is Descartes' way out depended on having innate ideas. For Locke and the other empiricists, there are no innate ideas. When we come into this world, our mind is like that whiteboard over there. It's a tabula rasa, a blank slate, and Locke spends a good bit of time in the first book of his essay concerning human understanding, a book that he wrote over the course of 10 years, trotting out various arguments against innate ideas. Now, we're not going to look at them. But so he rejects innate ideas. Well, that means that he can't use Descartes' way out. And we also saw that Descartes' way out falls victim to what has been called the Cartesian circle. That is, in logic, if you assume what you're supposed to be proving in the premises, then logicians call that a circular argument, a petitio principii in the Latin. And so you haven't proved anything. You've simply assumed what you claim to be proving, and you could have what's called a vicious circle, and that's kind of what Descartes has, because you say, well, how can I have confidence in my beliefs about the external world, Descartes? Well, Descartes would say, because there is a God who is no deceiver and is not deceiving you about those things, and neither is an evil genius doing so. You're not dreaming. There's no evil genius out there. There's a good God who's not deceiving you when you think there's a real table there. But Descartes, how do I know that God exists and God is no deceiver? Well, Descartes says, you know what? I can prove the existence of God from my necessarily true, clear and distinct ideas. But of course, you can say, well, how do you know that those ideas are necessarily true? Well, Descartes' answer is, it's because God exists and he's no deceiver, and he guarantees that what I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true. In other words, the whole thing goes in a circle. So the empiricists have are in the egocentric predicament, and they don't have Descartes' way out. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, but one of the things that empiricists like Locke try to do is to show how it is that we can have some concepts that seem to go beyond our experience, right? Remember, I said Socrates says that in order to judge, say, that two things are equal but not perfectly equal, we need to have experience with something beyond the senses, namely the form of perfect equality. And that's how we can make that ordinary judgment. But if things like lines are not perfectly equal here, then Socrates says we must have experienced this in a prior life, and we have innate knowledge of perfect equality. well, if you're going to reject innate ideas, then it sort of behooves you to come up with an alternate story of how we can have concepts about things that seem to be beyond the senses, like perfection or perfect equality. And basically, what the empiricists said is we're capable of kind of extrapolating things out. In other words, just from the activity of our own minds, we're capable of generating these ideas. We don't need to have had them put into our minds at birth, like Descartes thought, or experience them in another realm like Plato thought. So now this is weird. This is differences in software. When I did this a while ago in an earlier version, and the image was right side up, and something in later versions invert this image, and the secret is buried deep within the code. But at any rate, I said you could talk about having an imperfect knowledge of computers, but you could extrapolate that out to what it would be to have perfect knowledge. So take something like infinity. Basically, the story of the empiricists is we don't have to have an innate idea of infinity, just like we don't have to have an innate idea of perfection. We can essentially manufacture that idea. We can construct it out of our own minds from things about the finite. So from finite or limited space, we can construct the idea of infinite space. And so their thought was, we don't have to have, as Descartes thought, the attributes of God planted in our own minds as an innate idea. We can, from contingent existence, talk about necessary existence. From limited duration in time, get the concept of God as being eternal. From our limited knowledge, we can extrapolate and construct the concept of omniscience, of God as being, all-knowing, and from limited power, omnipotence, that God is all-powerful, from wisdom infinite. So in other words, they're saying we don't have to have the idea of God imprinted in us from birth, like Descartes thought. So they thought we can get along without the claim that we have innate ideas. But now here is the trick to understanding Locke's book, and of course you don't really get much of the actual book, but the essay concerning human understanding is to understand that he uses idea in some different senses. In fact, what tends to be frustrating with some philosophers is they will be very clear and careful to define their terms at the beginning of an article or book, and then they'll go on to use them in ways that are not consistent with the ways they originally defined them. But for Locke, and this is what I mean, that for him ideas are the immediate objects of perception. They are what we are immediately aware of in our experience. So Locke says an idea is whatever is the object of the understanding when a man, meaning man in the generic sense, when a human being thinks. Another definition he says is whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking. Well, look at that last claim. In other words, any aspect of our experience for Locke is an idea. This is why I like to say the term idea for Locke includes everything and the kitchen sink, which can also be an idea or a collection of ideas on his philosophy. Virtually everything we experience is an idea for him. So it includes very diverse things. No, we might think, well, okay, I have an idea that in my mind that 2 + 2 = 4. You know, we talk about ideas as being abstract things. But for Locke, it also includes things like sensations. You know, the smell of flowers in the spring, you know, the sight of birds, the sound that a bird makes. Ideas from Locke, for Locke, can also come and be about things internal to me, like a pain I have in my shoulder or my knee. For that, you know, that for Locke is also an idea. Or, you know, feeling warmth and cold, or perceptions, and the memory of something that I once saw. So he says that that ideas come from two sources, basically from sensation, and here he means, you know, the sensory and observational experiences we have about what's going on around us, outside of us. But Locke says we can also get internal ideas when we reflect upon our own minds and the operations there. So here he's taking Descartes' version of what thinking is, and he's really going into much more detail. Now, I know this tends to get very detailed and seemingly picayune, but what seem to be little nitpicky distinctions here had an absolutely profound influence on thought for the next, 200 years, basically. Because it's these distinctions that, led to some very skeptical views. So for Locke, our ideas are simple or complex. Basically, simple ideas are ideas of the varied attributes of a thing. And a complex idea would be what I have of the whole thing. I mean, that's one way of saying it. So if we're talking about an old-fashioned telephone, and it's coming to be that I would I can imagine a time when I would flash a slide like this, and students would say, well, what's that? As more and more people give up their landlines for good. But suppose he had a red telephone, or we have this coffee mug on the desk. The point is, for Locke, that would be a complex idea. In other words, our experience of it would be a complex idea. And what would be the parts of that complex idea? Well, the various qualities that we perceive the telephone to have, its shape, its size, its color, its weight, the sound it has, whether it's cool to the touch. All of these properties would be simple ideas we have that go into making up the complex compound idea of the telephone. Okay, we got about 10 minutes. So Now, this is a very important distinction. The distinction between what Locke calls primary qualities of a thing and secondary qualities. So, what are they? And well, secondary properties for him are things that are not really in the objects themselves. Colors, taste, smells. My dad, for instance, was colorblind. Presumably, when he came up to a traffic light, his own subjective experience, what he was experiencing when he looked at the traffic light as somebody who was colorblind was different from what I experienced when I look at it, you know. And so, and you know, I mean, I couldn't even walk into the house if my mother was cooking something with green peppers. Occasionally she'd make stuffed green peppers. I couldn't even walk into the house when she was doing that because I was so averse to anything having to do with green peppers. Whereas when I was in grad school, one of the guys in the house I was in, his favorite snack was an English muffin, cottage cheese, and a raw green pepper cut up. And I wouldn't have touched, well, I like cottage cheese and English muffins, but the green pepper I wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole. So tastes are kind of subjective for us, and smells, you know. And so for Locke, these are not really qualities in things as we perceive them. And Locke uses various arguments, and Berkeley repeats this argument. But what's the point of this? I don't know if you looked over the slide. But the point of this is to somehow show that heat and cold are not really properties of a perceived thing like the water in these pails, but they're subjective and in us. How does Locke do this? Well, okay, other thing is that. Suppose we have like this is hot, this is cold, and this is maybe room temperature, okay? Well, you know what happens if you put one hand in the hot one in the cold, right? I remember when I was a kid, we had an old-fashioned sink, which I discovered when I had to buy some washes for it recently, and you know, even the people at the big box stores couldn't give me. I was going to replace the inner mechanism too, besides the washers. They didn't have anything close. But you know, if my brother and I would come in from sledding and our hands are cold because my parents like these knit gloves that they don't do anything except get wet if you're out there sledding, right? So my hands are cold, and I turn on. There's a separate hot and cold water. I turn on the cold water. It feels hot. It feels warm because my hands are so cold from being out there sledding in the snow. Well, similar experience, right? So he says, take the one that's in the hot and put it in the room temperature water, and how does this water feel? Feels cool to the touch, doesn't it? Because your hand has just been in hot water. Suppose he even had some ice cubes. Take the hand that's in the cold water, put it in the room temperature water, and it's like me running the water after sledding. This is going to feel warm. So Locke would say, well, wait a second. You can't have the same water being both warm and cold at the same time. That's an outright contradiction, an impossibility. So how do you avoid the contradiction? You say that heat and cold are not really properties of the water, they're subjective and in us. And so this is what Locke does with what he calls the secondary properties. He says they're not in things. But we'll find what he calls primary properties, though, he says really are. This is a good place to stop. But can you see the point of Locke has a number of arguments like this meant to show that secondary properties are in us, not in things themselves. Okay. Well, did anyone sign up for this for this week? Everyone's mañana. All right. Well, that's okay. That's okay. Like I say, we'll get them in. And feel free, to come in and practice, or come in a little early and set yourself up if you're due to go on a given day. Okay. Well, I'm going to continue on in the British Empiricism PowerPoint. I also made visible one on Locke's politics, which we may go into before we go into some of the other theory of knowledge stuff. Okay.
Do you have any extras for the oral report thing that we have to turn in?
Yeah,
Because I know what I
should.
want to do. I just don't have the paper to give you.
Okay.